on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Well, it may be Autumn Statement Day, but Prime Minister's Questions is still on the way at 12 o'clock, as usual, on a Wednesday afternoon. And we are live on the Times Radio YouTube channel. Hello to everybody watching. Do submit your questions to me, and I'll do my best to answer the ones that don't libel me or take my name in vain. So there you go. I'm all up for constructive criticism, though. So PMQs is on the way. Welcome to all of you watching on YouTube. Head to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Put it on your smart TV, and you can see. You can try and guess my age if you like from my face in glorious HD. And watching it with me, as well as Tim Shipman, will be Times Red Box editor Lara Spirit. Hi, Lara.
Hi, Patrick.
Always a funny one, PMQs before a major fiscal event, because neither side wants to preempt what they're going to say ahead of that budget. The government doesn't really have anything to give away. Naturally, unless it's an enormous story, it's not going to touch the sides of any news coverage, or it'll inevitably be overshadowed by the announcements made by the chancellor. So it's a tricky one for Keir Starmer and indeed Stephen Flynn of the SNP to play, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I'm told that Keir Starmer will go on a topic that you wouldn't be expecting him to go on today. It's not going to be the kind of usual cut and thrust of PMQs. It's actually an opportunity, really, for the opposition to choose a topic often that might be considered a bit esoteric or strange in the normal weeks of PMQs, something that doesn't necessarily lead the news on a typical day, but which the opposition have a line that they want to get out, or a kind of challenge to the Prime Minister that they want to be heard. So I think that will be interesting to watch today. And of course, it's an interesting vibe in the chamber because MPs are so frenetic. Everybody's expecting this budget. It's a massive moment. It's one of Rishi Sunak's only remaining chances this side of the new year to kind of make a dent in that great big polling deficit. So the mood of MPs, I think, will not be one that will be particularly subdued. But as you say, it is a different PMQs to usual because it is by no means a set piece event of parliamentary business today.
And I know for the team that helped Keir Starmer with this, they find these occasions quite useful because the pressure's off. They can try out different lines and attacks on the Prime Minister, see how they go down. So even if, as you say, the subject matter looks eccentric or it's not something we expected Keir Starmer to ask, it can be quite revealing about the priorities of his operation and his team.
Exactly. So that's, I think, what you will see today from Starmer. It's not unimportant, seeing as because the budget follows hot off the heels of it, there will be many more eyes on it than usual, you might think. So actually, it's not the case that you can just kind of do away with PMQs. It's a good opportunity. It's one that I'm sure Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak will still be preparing for in earnest today. Well,
hello to all of you on the YouTube. Hello to Candia Peterson in stormy upstate New York and Stephen P in Taunton. Must try harder, Stephen, to match stormy upstate New York. Do get in touch. Tell me where you're listening from. Insults, feedback, all gratefully received. Lara, you'll be joining me and Tim Shipman back in the studio in about 5 minutes, 10 minutes time. So I'll let you go and prepare for that cruel and unusual punishment. I'll see you shortly. And of course, it's not just PMQs and Westminster that are making the news today in politics, because the government's chief medical officer, Professor Sir Chris Whitty, is giving his second day of evidence to the COVID inquiry. Yesterday, he revealed, he was one of the faces of the government's pandemic response, remember, but he revealed in his evidence yesterday that he thought the first lockdown in March 2020 was imposed a bit too late. And today he's been asked by Hugo Keith KC about the degree of inevitability of lockdowns. He says, Chris Whitty, that the government realised two things in early March 2020.
Firstly, a realisation that we were a lot further along the path, well, significantly further along the path than we had thought we were, meaning that a lot of thinking and a lot of activity had to be accelerated that we thought could have been done later, had to be brought forward in very short order. And the second was a realisation that we were really not going to get on top of this with anything other than quite a large number of measures. Now, in theory, had the force of transmission been somewhat lower, it might have been possible to get on top of them, get R below 1 reliably, that's a key word, reliably, short of a full mandatory lockdown, in theory. But once we got to above a certain point of force of transmission, based on the modelling we had, with all the caveats that go with that, it looked extremely unlikely that we could reliably get to that stage. So I think we shouldn't see it as a sort of a yes-no on this. My view was that the measures that were brought in on the 16th by the Prime Minister, the stay-at-home orders and so on, were virtually inevitable and had been, in my view, for some time. It was a matter of when rather than whether.
That was Professor Chris Whitty at the COVID inquiry, where he's given his seventh day, well, we might get into that, of evidence. Times Health correspondent Eleanor Hayward has been watching today's proceedings. She joins me now. Hello.
Hello.
What have we learned then today?
So most of the evidence this morning focused on the kind of terrifying period in March 2020 when it was becoming clear, and Chris Whitty used the words that the NHS would break unless there was a lockdown, and this particular kind of panic over intensive care beds running out, particularly in London. He's also touched on Rishi Sunak's Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which is very interesting. If you remember, then Boris Johnson's witness statement to the inquiry says that he definitely consulted Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance about the scheme. And Whitty was very, very clear that he was not consulted about Eat Out to Help Out.
That's really interesting.
So he said, he speaks in a sort of very sober term, but he said, me and Patrick would have remembered if we'd been asked about Eat Out to Help Out.
And you talk about the sobriety of Chris Whitty's style. That's been one of the striking things. Unlike some of the people who've given evidence before him, particularly the politicians and advisors, he's not been drawn into sniping or personal insults or blaming individuals or casting aspersions on their character, has he?
No, it's been really refreshing, actually. I think the inquiry turned into a bit of a circus when Dominic Cummings and the like were giving evidence, and I think those people were kind of playing to the gallery a bit, and that Hugo Keith, the main counsel, you can tell he kind of loves it when he can draw a personal insult out of the witnesses, and he's been pressing Chris Whitty to try and get him to insult Boris Johnson and the like, and Chris Whitty is just not playing up to it at all. He's very clear. He's like, it's not my job to criticise individuals. He'll talk about systemic failures, and he gives a very clear account of it, but he's not playing up to this chaos or the snipey WhatsApp messages or anything like that.
No. And which is sort of the point of the inquiry. It's for experts like Chris Whitty and politicians to draw lessons about how Britain might be better prepared the next time a pandemic hits. Yeah,
exactly. And I think anyone watching Dominic Cummings' evidence, I think, will have been left feeling pretty depressed about the state of how the country is run. But I mean, Chris Whitty's evidence has, I think, provided some reassurance that it's not all complete chaos with people who don't really know what they're doing. I mean, one of the most interesting things about his evidence yesterday was actually how he cottoned on very early to he called it an existential threat posed by COVID. He said he was aware of that by late January 2020, and he sent an email to Number 10 explaining that. I mean, it wasn't quite acted upon, but it wasn't kind of just headless chickens running around in the first 3 months of 2020.
As listeners may have inferred from Dominic Cummings'
exactly.
Dominic Cummings' evidence. This afternoon, we are going to hear from Professor Sir Jonathan Van Tam, the famous JVT, who was Chris Whitty's deputy during the pandemic, and Dame Angela McLean, who's the current chief scientific advisor. Her predecessor, Patrick Vallance, gave evidence yesterday. What do you expect we'll hear from them?
Well, Angela McLean's actually dropped out of today's now because Chris Whitty overran. I think Jonathan Van Tam, he was the person who was tasked with specifically preparing for the pandemic. So he was the first person in charge of COVID in January 2020. And I think Chris Whitty touched on it yesterday, that there was a bit of a disagreement where Jonathan Van Tam was the very first person to raise the alarm. And Chris Whitty sort of said to him, are you sure we need to worry about this right now? So it's going to be interesting if Jonathan Van Tam is saying, I was ignored by Chris Whitty, I was ignored by everyone. This is sort of very, very early days when it was only in China. And I think Jonathan Van Tam, I mean, he became very well known during the press conferences for his football
long analogies,
things like that. It'll be interesting to see if he gives a few more sort of spicy quotes than Whitty did, because he also had a front row seat to all the drama in Downing Street, and I wonder if he'll comment on that.
He'll be slightly more forthcoming. Well, we'll see. Eleanor Hayward, Times Health correspondent, you'll be covering it for the Times online, in print and here on the radio, so don't miss any of Eleanor's coverage over the course of the day. Just head to the Times website, get yourself a subscription if you don't have one already. Right, an hour earlier than usual, it's time for this.
Say my name, say my name. Oh, mysterious girl. Oh, nah, what's my name?
I don't know who he is, but I think that you do.
You don't know my name. That's not my name. That's not my name. That's not my name. That's not my name.
Thank you very much. Tim Shipman has just joined me in the studio for the conclusion of today's game of Guess Who and PMQs Unpacked, which is just coming up. Remember, 5 clues. You've had 2 hours today to name our mystery politician. Here are your clues again. You're looking for a politician who's born to Welsh parents, a member of the House of Lords, doctor by profession, married to a literary agent, and foreign secretary before they were 40. It could only be one person, and here it is.
That's not my name. That's not my name. That's not my name. That's not my name.
We will not recover our economic strength, nor will we recover our national self-confidence unless we have a new start, a fresh start, a quite different form of politics.
I think that the SDP Liberal Alliance will be in a position where no government can be formed without our agreement. I've never charged a patient in my life. I long to see a better quality of healthcare.
Power goes to your head, and we need to be aware of it.
Yes, it's David Owen, Dr. David Owen, youngest foreign secretary in the history of Britain, leader of the SDP, married to the literary agent Debbie Owen. What more could you want from a politician? Born to Welsh parents in Plymouth, still a member of the House of Lords at 85. There's a good Redbox podcast with Matt and David Owen if you look it up. Let's see who got it. Congratulations to Ian on the emails who got it first. Heather from Barton-on-Sea, Ben in Edinburgh, Paul in Wolverhampton, Jess in Glasgow, Kate from Worcester, Basil in Hereford, Lisa, Neil, Nigel, Greg Weardale, Paul in Liverpool, Jill in London, David in East Sussex, Stephen Thomas on the emails, Nick Alexander, Jane Griffiths on her second go, Greg Round, and Owen Lomas, who's currently listening in Udaipur in India. And special commiserations to Rachel, Alice Thompson, not Rachel Sylvester. Always get those two mixed up. Alice Thompson and Robert Crampton, who couldn't get it, sadly. Jess in Glasgow is on the line. Jess, how did you get it?
Well, as soon as you said he was a proper medical doctor, I knew it right away, because I was active in Labour politics round about the Gang of Four.
Really?
And Roy Jenkins was our local MP.
In Hillhead, in Glasgow Hillhead.
Yeah, that's right. So you tended to pick up on all the minutiae of the the Gang of Four. So that's how I got it.
Like Roy Jenkins, did you think David Owen was a bit uppity, bit bumptious?
I didn't really pay much. I was into women's politics at the time, very active in women's politics in the Labour Party. So I was more disappointed about
the split itself.
In the Gang of Four, whose name escaped me.
Indeed. Well, Jess in Glasgow, thanks very much for joining us. It's time for PMQs Unpacked.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
It's 12 o'clock. I'm Patrick Maguire, in for Matt Chorley here on Times Radio. In a moment, we'll be bringing you PMQs Unpacked, but first a moment to look at this news headlines this lunchtime. The Chancellor has arrived at Parliament to deliver his autumn statement after Prime Minister's questions. Jeremy Hunt is expected to reduce national insurance payments, which are currently 12% for many employees and 9% for the self-employed. He'll also increase benefits in line with September's inflation figure of 6.7%, higher than the 4.6% of October. Professor Chris Whitty has confirmed that he also didn't know about the Eat Out to Help Out scheme launched by Rishi Sunak in the summer of 2020. The Chief Medical Officer for England has told the COVID inquiry he would have recalled it if the scheme had been discussed with him. The release of more hostages from Gaza will begin tomorrow. That's according to Israel's foreign minister. 50 hostages will be freed by Hamas and 150 Palestinians from Israeli jails. That's part of a deal reached overnight and approved by Benjamin Netanyahu's war cabinet. There'll also be a 4-day pause in fighting, which could be extended. And according to NHS figures, 1 in 5 older teenage girls has an eating disorder. That figure was just 1% in 2017. We'll have more news for you in an hour and a full news roundup at past. But now, live on Times Radio and the Times Radio YouTube channel, it's time for this.
PMQs Unpacked on Times Radio. Unpacking the politics and cutting through the crossfire.
Order, order. I call Patrick Maguire and Tim Shipman.
And Lara Spirit too. Woo! We've not yet got the Speaker of the House to make time out of his busy schedule to record yet another jingle, but he will. He will. I'm sure he will. How are you both, Tim? How are you?
Very excited. Big day in politics.
It's a massive day in politics. Is this the beginning of, I mean, the election campaign's already begun, but is this the beginning of the election campaign in earnest?
I mean, yes. But it's already begun. No, I mean, look, the Tories have had several opportunities to change the narrative and have not so far succeeded in doing so. And this is the last obvious one before you get into New Year relaunches. We've had a reshuffle, we've had a King's speech, we've had a party conference speech. None of them have moved the dial. They've got a little bit more money to play with than they thought a month ago, and they're now going to try and cut tax a bit and give people some hope and expectation. And before all that, Starmer gets a go at Sunak, which he won't get a go at the Chancellor later. It's the Leader of the Opposition who responds for a budget, but we'll get the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, today. So this is Starmer's opportunity to do some economy if he wants to and get himself on the evening news.
Do you think he wants to do some economy, Lara Spirit?
I don't understand that he will do some economy in Prime Minister's questions. I think he's more likely to go for something a bit left field, given that this is the kind of one of those pre-budget PMQs where you have an opportunity and a bit more leeway to do something a bit less news, kind of dependent on the news that day. So that'll be interesting to see what he chooses and how Sunak
he also needs to make
that.
up for last week, which was pretty much a Horlicks from Keir Starmer with a lot of open goals. Rishi Sunak's year as Prime Minister passed without a great deal of Mickey taking and, kind of running the rule over his regime so far. And you wonder whether Starmer might sort of try and revisit a bit of that and kind of put the context of of the autumn statement into a sort of wider state of politics kind of questioning.
Well, if you're watching along on the Times Radio YouTube channel, do tell us what you think Keir Starmer should be asking. Hello to all of you. Hello to Terry B, listening to from Eccles by the Manchester Ship Canal. Thank you to Johnny Seven for listening in Maida Vale, David Hill in Banburyshire, Martin O'D in unsunny Norfolk. God, the first one we got was upstate New York, and it's been downhill from there. Apologies to the good people of Northolt. Tim, do you think Labour are going to struggle over the course of today to respond to a Tory party that now has money to play with?
Well, look, they've been so far arguing over, where you spend a very small pie. Maybe it gives Labour a little bit of leeway to have an argument about whether the Tories have made the right sort of choices, but cutting national insurance is reasonably popular and is the kind of thing that you can imagine a Labour Party doing as well. So I'm not sure there's a lot of kind of obvious political ground to be gained by opposing what Jeremy Hunt's going to announce.
Just to update you both on our lobby colleagues back in the House of Commons press gallery, there's been a power cut at the worst possible time, or the best possible time, if you're not a massive fan of political journalism. Every journalist in the House of Commons has been hit by a power cut. So there you go. If the quality of budget analysis you read today is a bit more, a bit sharper, that's why. Right, let's head to the Commons chamber for Rishi Sunak's first question. You're listening to PMQs Unpacked here on Times Radio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like the Prime Minister, I know the whole House will welcome the agreement reached overnight. We repeat our calls for Hamas to release all hostages immediately. This humanitarian pause must be used to get the hostages out safely, to tackle the urgent and unacceptable humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, and to make progress to a full cessation of hostilities. Mr. Speaker, in recent years, the international community has treated the two-state solution as a slogan rather than a serious strategy. and that must now change. Like the Prime Minister, I'm sure I speak for everyone in the House in saying our hearts go out to the families and friends of the 4 young men from Shrewsbury who tragically lost their lives this week. It's a living nightmare for any parent, and I can hardly begin to imagine their loss. Mr. Speaker, this week the Prime Minister unveiled the latest version of his 5 pledges for the country. Let's hope he has more success with these than the last ones. Did he forget the NHS?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, not only when I became Prime Minister, just weeks after becoming Prime Minister, we injected record funding into the NHS and in social care. We also unveiled the first ever long-term workforce plan in the NHS's 75-year history. But I'm pleased he mentioned the 5 pledges because, as he knows, 3 of them are economic, and on a day which we will focus on the economy, I'm pleased to report that we have indeed halved inflation, no thanks to the party opposite. We have indeed grown the economy, and we have indeed reduced debt. That's a Conservative government delivering for this country.
Interesting question from Keir Starmer, and indeed interesting opening remarks leading into his difficulties on Gaza, seeking to basically sort of own the truce that's been agreed, the humanitarian pause he's been calling for, and then a very pointed question about the NHS.
Yeah, I mean, Starmer's been slightly fortunate having had this long-running row that we've now finally got a sort of a hostage exchange and a pause. You sort of wondered whether he might have said, you know, we'll use this pause for important political reasons and to stop having a go at me. Might have been how he put it. But yeah, I mean, I find it slightly curious that Sunak's announced 5 new pledges and has blatantly dropped 2 of the ones that he didn't hit from the first round. You know, yes, they put lots of money into the NHS, and I think, you know, everyone would recognise that the NHS keeps hoovering up money and hasn't necessarily reformed. But, you know, they've got more money, and they've done this workforce plan, which we're going to hear endless amounts about up to the general election, you know, long-term planning and all that kind of stuff. Surprised we didn't hear that phrase from Sunak. But, you know, they've failed to deliver on tackling the huge backlog of operations that have not taken place and the waiting lists. I think there have been some improvements in some of the short-term waiting, but it's been it's still a running sore in Whitehall, and obviously one that he'll probably get around to talking about in the next question is: did you forget to stop the boats as well? And we've got immigration figures coming tomorrow, and my sources in government say that whatever political gains the Tory party might get out of today's autumn statement are likely to be washed away big style with the immigration figures tomorrow. So if Starmer pushes on that now, I think he's, you know, building a kind of context for a week that's going to be quite difficult for the government.
It is striking, Lara, isn't it, that Rishi Sunak's new 5 priorities, are we now just pretending that he didn't make the previous 5?
I mean, some people, honestly, probably will. It was interesting listening to Laura Trott, one of the newest members of Rishi Sunak's cabinet after the reshuffle, of course, in the Treasury, put on the spot on Times Radio earlier this week on the morning broadcast round and asked, just after they'd been announced, to name all 5 of them. And it was clearly, palpably relieved at being able to actually recall them accurately. And I did feel actually almost quite bad for being asked for them, because they are very many a number. They are becoming quite difficult to recall. Just on the immigration figures tomorrow, I think it'll be interesting to see from the OBR's outlook how they have factored in growth on account of migration. Neil O'Brien, who of course stood down in that reshuffle, formerly a minister, he this morning raising concerns about the OBR having too optimistic forecasts for the contribution that migration makes to growth. That is a very, very live debate in the Conservative Party, and I think that will be a very interesting one to watch today.
It certainly will be. Keir Starmer mentioned the forthcoming pause in hostilities in Gaza just then. Breaking news just out now. It's going to begin at 8 a.m. tomorrow, the pause in fighting in Gaza. Right, let's hear Rishi Sunak's response to Keir Starmer's second question now.
Well, the reason he ignored the NHS, not only in his new pledges, but just now, is because 7.8 million people are currently on the waiting lists. That's 500,000 more than when he pledged to bring them down nearly a year ago. And the Prime Minister just claimed that this is all about economic growth. So let me ask him, if a labourer or a care worker is forced to wait a year for an operation, how are they meant to help grow the economy?
Mr. Speaker, we're doing an enormous amount to bring waiting lists down. Enormous amount. Expanding patient choice, rolling out new community diagnostic centres, new surgical hubs, as well as putting more doctors and nurses in our ward. But I guess the question, Mr. Speaker, is when he talks about targets and waiting lists, I really just hope that the Welsh Labour government aren't listening. Because after 25 years in power, they're missing every single one of his targets. Weren't they meant to be his blueprint?
It's really interesting, that, isn't it?
Chorley would bang his bell at that point.
Yeah,
I
he
think
would.
It's fair to
He's
say.
taking it with him on the cruise, so alas, I don't have it. But yeah,
That was
variations on a familiar theme.
Yes, it's a familiar theme, and it's perfectly legitimate familiar theme as well. And Starmer did sort of mistakenly talk about Welsh Labour being his model, which in healthcare at least is a problem. And it's one that people listening in will be sort of sighing into their sofas to have heard once more. But it's sort of interesting, this. I mean, I thought the way Starmer asked the question in terms of trying to frame it in terms of growth was kind of interesting. It sort of means that Lara was definitely right and I was a bit right in what we were predicting at the top, which is that he's trying to sort of economise a debate about the health service. And it's a reasonable point that if everyone's sitting at home with a gammy leg and can't get the operation they need, they're not going to be out carrying bricks around for a living.
Exactly. And Lara, it allows Labour to talk about the same issue that the government is talking about, i.e. the chronically ill and disabled people who are not in work, without necessarily getting drawn into a conversation, sort of reframing the same conversation that the government wants to have about benefits and welfare.
Yeah, I think Tim was right and I was wrong in my predictions. I think you're being generous, Tim. But it's interesting. I was talking to somebody yesterday from Starmer's team, and they were saying that Rishi follows this real blueprint, which is the right way to do it in their mind, whereby he's asked a question, he will make cursory mention of the specifics of it. He'll go to the section of his book, in this case, the big section of the folder that says NHS. He'll reel off some facts and achievements, and then he'll do one final jibe and attack line. And when it comes to the NHS, the only attack line that he seems to use is Wales. That is the common. I mean, can you think of another way that he signed off these NHS?
Not really, no. And
attack lines.
It's basically all they've got. But equally on the other foot, if Labour have been in power for a year, we'll see how well they've got on. With not a lot of money to hand. I think there's a danger for Sunak. While I think that point is legitimate and reasonable, the way he does it, as you just explained, it was a bit glib, the way it just sort of... You could sense the relief in his voice that it's like, I can now get to my sort of hoary old partisan attack line.
Right, well, now it's time for another. Let's go back to the comments for Rishi Sunak's third answer and Keir Starmer's third question. Remember, we're live on the Times Radio YouTube channel. Do tune in if you want to see me, Tim and Lara live. I promise you it's worth it. And of course, you can see all the action in the House of Commons too. But let's head there for Keir Starmer's third question.
Mr. Speaker, more than double the entire population of Wales are currently on a waiting list in England. Yeah. He really needs to take some responsibility. And on his watch, 2.5 million people are too sick to work, with the majority also suffering from mental health issues. On top of his failures on waiting lists, can he tell us how many people are waiting for mental health treatment?
Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, we've injected record sums to expand the number of mental health treatments in our country. But, Mr. Speaker, I talked about the practical things that we are doing with CDCs and surgical hubs. But he doesn't also seem to realise that the union action that he fails to condemn and that his members of parliament support from the picket lines have led to several 100,000 cancelled appointments, all making waiting lists worse. And he asked about Wales, but we can look at it. In Wales, over 70,000 people are waiting over 18 months for treatment. compared to in England, where thanks to our efforts, we have virtually eliminated 18 months' wait. And that's the difference between us, Mr. Speaker. He wants to play politics, we get things done.
Very interesting that you should bring up the unions there, Tim.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's kind of home terrain for Sunak. And I think, I mean, if you talk to people in government, they do genuinely say that the problem, they would have made a lot further progress had they not been having sort of problematic strikes. And certainly the one that the consultants led in the week of the Conservative Party conference made them extremely angry. And I think, again, I can understand their frustration. They're desperately trying to tackle this, and they're just really trying to make progress on what is an important metric for the country. It's sort of slightly bizarre that if they were doing well on long-term... I said short-term waits earlier, and I meant long-term waits. They've brought down the number of people on the long-term. I wonder whether he might have been better with his second batch of targets to have put something sort of vaguely achievable in terms of that was still aspirational, but was achievable, rather than ignoring it altogether and giving Labour an opening to just say they don't care about the NHS again.
It's very interesting as well, Lara, to hear Keir Starmer turn Wales to his advantage in the context of a health debate.
Yeah, because I suppose he's had ample indications that this would come up via Rishi Sunak as an attack line. So I think it would be foolish for them not to have a response on Wales. And that was an interesting one.
I fact-checked the population of Wales just to be sure as well. I thought it was about 4 million. I thought it might be touch and go. Actually, it's only 3.28 million. So Starmer is bang on with that.
Hey, we'll make a journalist of him next, given the size of Wales is the very bedrock of journalese, isn't it? So there you go.
I think it's interesting, just quickly, on the 18-month wait time, the waiting more than 18 months, because the government was understood to have quietly dropped that target because it was ticking up again. So for Rishi to say that those had been eliminated, I think was an interesting one.
Does it suggest maybe that the numbers are not flashing red quite as fiercely? Who
also
knows?
Quite bold to have a go at Starmer for making political point scoring. I mean, this is, it's a bit like that scene in Dr. Strangelove, isn't it, where they go, "You can't fight in here; it's the war room." This is PMQs. Prime Minister. I think there might be the odd political point flying around.
And here's another. Let's head back to the Commons chamber for Rishi Sunak's next answer.
So raising the waiting list by 500,000 is getting things done. It's through the looking glass, this one. I asked the Prime Minister how many people are waiting for mental health treatment. He knows the answer, he just doesn't want to give it. 1.2 million. 200,000 are children, some waiting nearly 2 years to be seen. Would the Prime Minister accept those kind of delays if it were one of his family or friends?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, one of the key things we are doing to bring down waiting lists is to expand the access of patient choice. It's a very straightforward idea to make sure that patients can choose where they get treated, and that way we will bring down waiting lists for mental health and other treatments far faster. Now, the Labour Party's policy on this is a total and utter mess. First, he promised, in his words, to ban NHS use of the independent sector. Then he said he wants more use of the independent sector. His shadow health secretary agreed with that, but then the deputy leader said that she would end it. As ever, you simply don't know what they stand for, and you can't trust a word they say.
Prime Minister's clearly feeling a bit lively today, Tim.
Well, and also I think getting his defence in first, because the natural place that Starmer would go next is, Prime Minister, don't you and your family use private healthcare?
Indeed.
So he's straight in there with Labour's policy on using, independent beds and all the rest of it. And clearly Wes Streeting takes a different view from Angela Rayner on that matter. And I think, the way he responded there, it does talk to something that, voters who are paying a bit of attention at the moment do wonder, they kind of, a lot of them are pretty sick of the government. A lot of them sort of think Labour looks all right. But there's a lot of people who don't really know what Labour would actually do. And the more you get, Wes Streeting and Angela Rayner disagreeing on an issue like this, it's not entirely clear what they would do. And that is something that the Tories will play with over the next year or so.
Yeah, that is the very divide, Labour people. Maybe on the second pint when the guard slips, that's the sort of language they start using. Wes versus Angela versus Rachel in the dynamic in the next government. Lara, what did you make of that exchange?
I thought it was very interesting. Specifically, I think that on mental health as an issue, it was an interesting example of when you choose something a bit more left field, it does become more difficult for Rishi Sunak to give a detailed response on it. You didn't really hear any reference to mental health that was particularly specific to that question in that answer. There was, cursory mention of patient choice, and then, as Tim says, a very strategic choice to talk about that key divide within some of those in the shadow cabinet. But mental health is an interesting one. I mean, for young people, I remember the Times running a poll on this showing that it was more important to young people than climate was as an issue. Like, it is a very important issue. We very seldom hear it mentioned in Prime Minister Questions. It's a good example, I think, of when you can use these sessions before a budget to choose something that might seem a little bit esoteric, perhaps, on a usual PMQs.
Right, time for Keir Starmer's penultimate question to Rishi Sunak.
As ever, no responsibility for the shocking state of the NHS. The truth is, the Prime Minister would not accept those weights for his family, and neither should anyone else. Yeah. This morning, I spoke to an NHS nurse. For many months, Cam struggled to find time to see her 14-year-old son, Mikey, until he became seriously unwell. And now he hasn't been able to be in mainstream education for over a year. Mikey's mum is having to balance nursing with caring and being a parent. And this isn't a one-off. There are families up and down the country in exactly the same situation, working hard, trying to get through the cost of living crisis whilst desperately worried about relatives who can't get the treatment they need. Yeah. How does he think they feel when they see the Prime Minister refusing to take responsibility and boasting that everything is fine?
Mr. Speaker, we're doing absolutely everything we can to put money into the NHS to bring down the waiting list, because I do want families up and down the country to have access to the healthcare that they need. He's absolutely right, they do deserve it. But then it is incredibly galling, Mr. Speaker, to hear this from someone who, when there are strikes happening in our hospitals and people are being denied access to emergency medical care, not only does he not have the strength to condemn it, he refuses to back legislation that would guarantee all the families that he talked about that access.
He's fond of this strike line, isn't he?
Yeah, I mean, look, for people he's trying to appeal to, that is probably an effective line. But I think the way Starmer asked that question was also quite telling. I mean, I'm sure it's a real case. It sounds heartrending. But the point of that is not the case. The point of it is to sound like you care. And good politicians are very good at emoting about healthcare. You think of, some botched moments in previous leadership debates where Theresa May was unable to emote about nurses. I think of Bill Clinton walking down to the front of a stage and grabbing someone by the hand and looking them in the eye and saying, "I feel your pain," essentially. And that's what Starmer's trying to do there. And he asks, you ask Sunak a question about how he feels and how other people feel, and he responds with, "Well, we're spending as much money as we can." And that, I think, is almost a trap. He kind of knows that's how Sunak will respond. And clearly this is only going to have an impact if people pay a great deal of attention or listening to PMQs Unpacked. But I think that general sense that Sunak is not very good at understanding what other people are going through and is all too prone just to respond with facts and figures. I think that is a sort of revealing question, even if it's not a kind of significant one in a sense.
Right, let's hear Keir Starmer's final question to Rishi Sunak.
This is on his watch. It's his responsibility. 13 years in, and all he's got to offer is trying to blame the opposition for his failures. Over and over again. Mikey's mum. I'll tell you what Mikey's mum said to me this morning, shall I, if you're so interested to hear. She said, and I'm going to quote her, she said, "Whatever spin the government puts on it, you can't hide the reality for ordinary working people." That's her words. Worth reflecting on. Yes. Now, I'm glad that in recent years, real progress has been made in tackling the stigma surrounding mental health. But the fact remains that the suicide rate for 15 to 19-year-olds has doubled since 2010, and suicide is now the biggest killer of men under 45. And they're not just statistics. Every single one is a tragic loss to families and to friends. Politics has the ability to turn this around. It means tough choices. If we were to scrap tax loopholes, we could have thousands more staff, more support in our schools, more support in our communities. That would allow us to treat patients on time, getting them back to work, back to their families, and crucially, giving them their lives back. This is about mental health. That's Labour's plan. Will he back it?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, it was this government that for the first time in the NHS's history ensured that it had a long-term workforce plan, providing it with record funding so that we can eliminate long waits, but also ensuring that it has the money that it needs to train record numbers of doctors and nurses, whilst radically reforming how they work to improve productivity, because the only way we will get everyone the treatment that they need is to make sure that the NHS has a fantastic staff that it needs, and it's this government that has put that in place. And we can look, because he talks about records, Mr. Speaker, because this is something that no government has done in the past. It's something I'm proud we've done. Labour's record on this issue is clear. It was a disastrous failure of workforce planning. And those weren't my words, Mr. Speaker. Those was the verdict of the Labour-chaired Health Select Committee. It was Labour that did not train the consultants that we would need now, that take 13, 14, 15 or years to train. And it's this government that is for the first time making sure that every family will finally have the doctors and nurses that they need.
You're listening to PMQs Unpacked here on Times Radio. Stay with us. More analysis and build up to the autumn statement coming in just a moment. Don't go anywhere.
This is Times Radio.
The UK COVID-19 inquiry is the independent public inquiry set up to examine the UK's handling of the pandemic.
Every Story Matters, in partnership with Times Radio, is your chance to share your experience of the pandemic directly with the inquiry.
Not only to put your personal story on record, but to inform the inquiry's investigations and shape recommendations for the future.
The pandemic affected us all, but it affected us all differently.
That's why every story matters.
For so many of us, sport is where we go to get away from the bad stuff we have to deal with. It's a chance to escape the pressures of life for a couple of hours. Then suddenly, everything stopped. This was the moment that millions of football fans realised there was no escaping the pandemic. We missed the company of teammates and fellow fans, even the banter with rival fans. It was a lonely and isolating time.
Whether your story is about your health, your work, or your well-being, the UK COVID-19 inquiry needs to hear from you to get a full picture of the pandemic.
COVID left its mark. Now leave yours.
Search Every Story Matters.
Purina Adventuros are delicious dog treats in a variety of wild flavours and irresistibly chewy textures, ideal for dogs with a nose for adventure. Sunday Times travel writer Yvette Caster has some great ideas about where your next adventure with your best friend could be.
Huge numbers of us now have dogs. There's now 12 million in the UK. More than half of dog owners take their pets on holiday. Most of them just don't want to leave their best friend behind. So thank goodness there's now loads of dog-friendly places to stay. Cafes, restaurants, attractions and parks. If it's fresh air you want, you cannot go wrong with the Lake District. Lake Windermere is a must. And if your dog is super fit, England's highest mountain, Scafell Pike, is a challenging but rewarding walk for very experienced hikers and capable dogs. The Lake District also has more than 100 miles of coastline and 29 beaches for dogs, so there's plenty of opportunities to splash around.
Times Radio with Purina Adventuros dog treats. Discover new wild adventures every day with Adventuros.
Hear from a big-name guest with Jane Garvey and Fee Glover every Monday to Thursday afternoon at 3:30.
This is Times Radio.
Yes, you're listening to Patrick Maguire, Informatually here on Times Radio. We've just brought you PMQs Unpacked, and we will, of course, bring you the autumn statement live from the House of Commons. Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, is about to get up and deliver that autumn statement, and with it, a bevy of tax cuts that Tory MPs have been agitating for. But before we take the Chancellor's statement, let's reflect on what we've just heard. Lara, your take on today's PMQs?
I think on that specific question of mental health and the NHS, it's difficult for Rishi Sunak, for reasons that we've talked about, to go solely on the attack on Labour-run Wales. I think it's equally difficult, actually, to go on strikes also in a situation where, I mean, Rishi Sunak saying there the strikes are among the most important reasons why people aren't getting treatment. Now, the strikes have certainly made it more difficult, but if they are, as the mood music seems to suggest, closer to reaching, under Victoria Atkins, the new Health Secretary, a deal with consultants, albeit not with junior doctors, that seems pretty intractable. Are they then saying that, those 7 or 8 million people on waiting lists are going to be seen soon after? Obviously, that's not the case. And so if those strikes are if there's some sort of landing zone whereby you reach some sort of resolution on those, that attack line is going to be somewhat redundant come future PMQ sessions.
And Tim, what can we expect from Jeremy Hunt now beyond individual tax cuts? What is the story he wants to tell?
He's got to tell a story about growth. I mean, that's the problem that the government's had. And that's actually really what the right of the Tory party is agitating about. Is there a plan to get this economy moving? And clearly he's going to try and weave together, tax breaks for businesses with a kind of getting the human capital that's being wasted sitting on benefits back into the system and make it look like they've got a plan going forward. David Cameron, who he's just brought back into the government, got himself elected in the end because he kept banging on about having a long-term plan for the economy. And I think what's really been missing is that sort of forward-looking thing. Sunak's been dealing with, the specifics of growth and, of debt and inflation and things like that, and they're very important. But if they're going to have any chance of stopping the bleeding, in a general election, they need to make people think that there's some, point to electing a future Conservative government. I think the significance of today, though, was as much tonal as it was about the words. And Starmer did that again in his peroration. It's not just statistics, he said, when he was talking about real people and health. And that's what Sunak's not terribly good at doing.
That is certainly one of the Prime Minister's weaknesses, isn't it? It always comes back to, I remember he did a phone-in on a lesser speech radio station fairly recently when someone called him up and said, look, my income has fallen from such and such to such and such. And he said, well, I think you'll find the average household has got, it's that sort of actuarial way of thinking, isn't it, Lara, that the Prime Minister sometimes struggles to break out of?
Yes, definitely. And I think I remember speaking to someone in Number 10 about Rishi Sunak out on the campaign trail, and there were some mumbles of discontent from Conservative MPs, I think it's fair to say, about how in Tamworth on the morning of the by-election, a lot of activists had been there, that, one of the appearances he was supposed to have there had been cancelled. And when you speak to some people in Number 10, there is often the sense that, David Cameron's appointment was framed in this light as well, letting Rishi focus on domestic policy priorities. This idea that Rishi is such a smart Prime Minister that actually you should just keep him in Number 10, make him kind of work doggedly on these kind of problems and then emerge to announce a kind of solution on it. Actually, such an important part of being a Prime Minister that wins elections is obviously, plainly, to be able to be out there talking to people and be able to appeal to them and to speak to their interests. And I think, we saw that infamous BBC word cloud on the morning of Conservative Party conference. What do people think of Rishi Sunak? The word rich emblazoned on the centre of it. I think Number 10 do still have a bit of a uphill climb in trying to make voters really believe that he cares about their priorities.
Right, the Speaker is just getting ready to call Jeremy Hunt to give his autumn statement, which will bring to you live here on Times Radio. Kate Borsay will pick up with all the analysis you need from across the political spectrum. Tim Shipman, in a word, though, we've just had a reshuffle that's been more wide-ranging. New Foreign Secretary. Is this Jeremy Hunt's last fiscal event as Chancellor, or will he still be in place for the spring budget?
There are some Conservatives who would like to put a woman in there and stop Rachel Reeves being the first female Chancellor of the Exchequer. That is possible. I think it's on balance probably unlikely.
Well, let's see how today's autumn statement goes down among Tory MPs in particular. And what might Labour say? How do Labour respond to tax cuts? Is Jeremy Hunt about to set a trap for Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves? You'll hear it all live on Times Radio. Kate Borsay, as I said, will pick it up afterwards. And you'll hear Jeremy Hunt here on Times Radio tomorrow. Here he is, the Chancellor, giving the autumn statement.
Mr. Speaker, I come today with good news. It's my